All right, we're back and spreading activation. All right. So, if we imagine that our memories are stored in a neural network, the theory of spreading activation argues that when there is enough um, stimulation coming in from outside in the form of a cue, that it causes your neurons to start having action potentials and responding to that stimulus. That activation will travel within the network from node to node based on the associative links between those neurons. And so that information will spread naturally. All right, so let's say that your job is to think of the capital of South Dakota. So here are all the different nodes representing South Dakota, and they didn't completely populate this out, but they kind of gave you a few. And if you know that the capital is, it's a man's name, let's say, but you can't quite remember what it is. Thinking of all these things having to South Dakota and knowing that it has to do with a man's name might ultimately bring you to this particular node and give you the opportunity to respond Pierre or Pierre, I think is how they pronounce it. I'm sorry about the coughing. So we have this spreading when we think of South Dakota to make us think about other things that have to do with South Dakota. And maybe if we have this little gap where we can't think of Pierre ourselves, we might have some spreading to, I know it's a man's name, and then we start thinking of different men's names, and then ultimately we may generate Pierre. We might generate Fred incorrectly. But spreading activation says once you're in a particular network, these nodes will start to get activated, sort of incidentally. You don't do it on purpose. Now, any particular node is more likely to get activated when more of its neighboring nodes are getting activated. So the more things that you're thinking about, the more vital those prompts are, the more likely you are to ultimately spread out to more things in that neural network. If enough information is coming in, it'll cause the node to fire, right? So the node will be likely to produce a response if there's enough information coming in, enough above threshold stimulation. When we say that it fires, what we're talking about is it may activate the neighboring cell, and remember that can be either exciting it, causing it to have its own action potential and pass the information to its neighbors, or inhibiting it, right? Remember, action potentials can be inhibitory, where the sending cell says, don't tell anybody else about this. Do not pass this along. So don't forget, it's not always just blindly activating the neighboring cell in a positive, excitatory way. It can also be inhibitory. This process of responses from the neighboring nodes actually draws more attention to the node that started it all. So if you've been given the prompt South Dakota, that node that starts the whole spread is the one that's going to be getting all the attention, right? Everybody's thinking, all these nodes are thinking South Dakota, South Dakota. How do I relate to South Dakota? What can I say about South Dakota? So all these nodes are trying to contribute. All right. So we're back to encoding specificity. So cues that were present will be encoded. I already mentioned that part about it, right? So it could be context. Was I above? Was I on the land or was I underwater? It also can be things like mood. Was I sad? Was I happy? Was I elated? Was I fearful at the time that I encoded that information? That mood will get encoded also, right? It could be your mental state. Am I really tired? Am I, sick? These kinds of things can be part of context. So cues that were present will be encoded along with the actual material to be encoded, and that's going to affect episodic memory more than it will affect semantic memory. Okay, I've been saying episodic and I've been saying semantic for at least 2 chapters, and it's finally time to clarify what that means. So here we go. All right, so types of long-term memory. there's the procedural type, and I don't really want to talk about that right now, but we will get to it, which is the knowing how. If you think about your procedural system, it's the part of your brain or your memory store, or however we want to talk about it, that knows how to do things, how to type, how to, juggle these kinds of things that you, especially a lot of times, can do without even thinking about, right? Like how to hit a baseball. The more you think about hitting a baseball, the less likely you are to actually hit the baseball, right? They've talked about people getting the yips where they're thinking too hard and now they can't do it anymore. I can't shoot a free throw anymore. I can't catch the ball. That happens when you stop letting it be a procedural thing and you try to make it into something else. So, knowing how oftentimes is something that you can do without thought. What I want to talk about is the declarative memory store, which is what I like to call the knowing that. So, procedural is knowing how, declarative is knowing that. So, I know that, you know, let's see what things I want to share. I know that I have a PhD. I know that I grew up in Southern California. I know that, um, you know, it's a sunny day. I know that, these kinds of things. That's what we're talking about. Whereas procedural is knowing how to do stuff. Declarative is made up of these two memory stores, the episodic memory store, which is personally relevant, personally experienced events, things that you directly experienced and that you directly remember having experienced. That's a key thing about episodic. Whereas semantic memory stores will contain factual knowledge. Now, some of the factual knowledge may be of things that you did personally experience, but you don't remember it anymore. You don't remember having experienced it. Now you just know that you experienced it. You don't know, you can't remember the actual experience. You know, you have memories like this where your family tells you about something that you did or something that you experienced when you were little, and you're like, I have no independent recollection of that at all. That's something that you know is true for yourself. We assume we're being told the truth by our family members who tell us we did stuff or experienced things. Hope they're telling us the truth, right? And so we know that it happened, but we don't have a personal experience of it. So those kinds of memories can be under semantic memory store. It doesn't have to be only facts like who was the first president or what's the date or things like that. That's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be impersonal stuff that's in semantic memory. It can be things about yourself that's in there too. All right, so let's compare episodic memory to semantic memory on some different qualities. So the first one is the likelihood of forgetting something. That likelihood of forgetting something that's in your episodic memory store is high. There are a lot of things that you have personally experienced that you don't you don't remember. You're like, I don't know. I think I was at that concert. I don't know. The likelihood of forgetting with semantic memory is low. It's in there. You probably have good enough robust cues for retrieving it. And so generally things that are in semantic memory, if it's inaccessible at a particular moment, it's probably going to become accessible later. Like the second you stop thinking about it, it pops back into your mind, right? You've had that tip of the tongue phenomenon where you're trying to remember the name of that actress and you can't remember. And then as soon as you walk away from the conversation, you're like, oh, I know what their name is now. Semantic memory store, you tend to be able to get access to it with the right kinds of cues. The usefulness, well, the usefulness of your episodic memory, we call it low, and you might be like, hey, my memories are useful. What are you talking about? But usefulness as far as, I don't know, getting us long range ahead, those kinds of things. I don't mean employment wise. I mean like helping us to survive, helping us to, move forward in life. It doesn't, episodic memories are not as important for those things. In fact, generally, if an episodic memory is that crucial, that useful, it'll move into a semantic memory. Semantic memories tend to be high in usefulness. There are lots of times that you will recall the information that's in semantic memory. Sometimes you're required to remember the things that are in semantic memory. So it tends to be coded as more useful. Recollective experience. What sense do you have that you're looking in your memory and trying to find this information? With your episodic memory, It's present. You feel like you're looking for that information. You feel like you're searching your memory banks, trying to remember something. Whereas with semantic memory, it just pops to mind. The things that are in your semantic memory store, a lot of people refer to as effortless, because the correct answer will just leap to mind. So you don't feel like you're searching your memory banks with semantic memory. The sensory component, to what degree do you have awareness of like what it smelled like, what the temperature was, what the thing tasted like, or what you were seeing at the time, or what you were hearing, like all those sensory things. Like with episodic memory, you tend to have that sensation of remembering all these sensory details about the event. Whereas with semantic, it's not present. You just know that you know these things. It's in semantic memory, a lot of times sort of disembodied. I guess it's a good way to say it. It is what it is. You just know these things. The presence of emotion, very similarly, episodic memory, you tend to remember those things, and with semantic memory, you do not. Semantic memory loses its emotional component, and it just becomes a fact. So sometimes we have things that, for example, start off very emotionally relevant. You maybe the first few times you tell the story to other people, you get the same emotions that you did before. You're just as happy as you were when it happened, or you're just as scared as when it first happened. And then over time, as it's moving into a semantic memory and losing its episodic quality, when you're recalling it, you may actually lose some of that emotional content. And what's weird about us as humans is that we look at other people and they're telling a story that we think, oh gosh, I'd be really upset if I was telling that story. Why is that person not upset? Well, if this is a story that has moved into semantic memory for them, where they're feeling maybe not as connected to it, it's not feeling as acutely episodic, and it's starting to move into semantic, it loses its emotional content. It becomes just a series of facts that you tell. And most things will become like that. Things that are very acutely episodic right now, where you can get back into that same place and you can feel what you felt before, it loses that over time. The more you process the information, the more you encode it, the more likely it is to move into semantic memory. So that's something that I guess is something that, depending on what the memory is, might be something to look forward to, right? It might be something you'd be glad to lose some of the emotional content. Other things, like I know, I'll give you the example of having a baby, right? Like everybody always says, oh, you don't remember what it felt like. And I always wondered, how can you not remember? It seems like a pretty big thing. It seems like the thing you would remember. And then I can tell you that, I remember giving birth to both of my children, and I don't have the emotional, reaction that I did immediately after their births at all. I mean, I'll say, almost have an experience where I'm like watching somebody else's story, almost. Not perfectly, but almost. I almost feel like that is just something that I know happened, not something that I experienced. And that's part of semantic memory. Now, in my defense, my kids are, it's been 30 years, so it's been a little while. So, but you would think that would be something you'd stay connected to. And that's just a little example, right? There are lots of different kinds of examples that you might be thinking of. In some ways, it's good that we lose that. Like some people say that the species would have died off if we remembered in detail childbirth, because no one would have a second child. And so that's maybe an advantage, right? And think about it with other kinds of memories, right? Things that maybe are unpleasant, you don't want to have to think about anymore. The good news is the more you do think about it, the more likely it is to move into semantic memory and lose some of its power. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't want to think about stuff, and we allow it to maintain power, and that's a different thing, whole different class. But for the purposes of this class, I just want to encourage that the more it's processed, the more likely it is to move into semantic memory and lose its emotional component. All right, let's wrap up this video with Frederick. So here's Frederick. He's a real person, and he is in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. Now, he has always been a big golfer, and so Daniel Schachter, who's a memory researcher from Harvard University, and I think you've seen him in our textbook, I don't know if it might be this chapter where you're going to encounter Schachter's research. I can't remember exactly where he first pops up. Um, but he would take Frederick golfing and kind of made some observations of what was going on with Frederick. So, the things that are present in golf that represent the different kinds of memory stores are, where am I trying to hit the ball? How many strokes have I taken so far? Those would be episodic memories, right? Those are things that are relevant. They're happening right now. I should know. Keeping track of those things. The semantic memory store would be invoked when you are remembering what a birdie is, for example, or what kind of strategies tend to work in this kind of scenario, or the general rules for golf. Like those would all be part of the semantic memory store. And then the procedural memory would be, all the physical stuff, like how to drive versus how to putt, and like that. So those are the different parts of the memory store that are invoked in this game. Skills that he maintained, he could drive and putt completely normally. Nothing had changed about that aspect of his game. He used the golf terms appropriately. He used them spontaneously, so he clearly still had all of that. He remembered all the rules and strategies. He knew whether you were allowed to pick up the ball or not pick up the ball, like all those details. And then where he had some deficits, he'd forget whose turn it was. He'd forget if he had just gone. He would forget that they had played together last week, right? Like he didn't remember the week by week by week games. And so, which system, based on these skills that he maintained and these deficits that he showed, which system do you think is being affected by the early stages of Alzheimer's disease? Well, hopefully you correctly selected episodic, right? That he's having. Now, ultimately, as Alzheimer's progresses, we'll start to see the other memory systems affected also. But early on in the beginning of Alzheimer's, where we tend to see the biggest impact would be in the episodic memory store. What did you have for dinner last night? Did you go to the grocery store or not? Did you take your pills or not? These kinds of details are where people with Alzheimer's in the early stages tend to show their biggest effects. Where did you leave your car keys? Um, as the disease progresses, everything will get impacted, but at the beginning, it tends to be episodic. All right, let's go ahead and stop here. We'll come back and talk about different ways to you measure whether something's in your memory or not.